Good evening or good afternoon, everybody, wherever you might be joining us from. Welcome to our Digital Debates series. This is the first in our series of a new environmentally focused series titled Designing the Future of Planet Earth Towards the Green Transition. We're excited to announce the launch of this new series. Of course, there's a lot of talk of the green revolution. There's a major shift underway, and future projections show that the world's energy outlook is set for a fundamental change. In the race to tackle climate change, dozens of the world's largest economies have adopted targets for net zero emissions by 2050, cutting fossil fuels and boosting clean energy. So through a series of insightful panel discussions, the first of which we're having this evening, Designing the Future of Planet Earth Towards the Green Transition will explore the next big challenges and expectations from the energy transition in the post-pandemic era. So for tonight's session in particular, the session is titled Renewing the World with Renewable Energy in the Post-Pandemic Era. Joining me today, we have three, we've lost one of our guests, hopefully we'll try to get him back here, but joining us this evening we have Samantha Gross, the Director of Energy Security and Climate Initiative at Brookings Institution. Thank you for being here. We have Professor Giacomo Luciani, who's the Scientific Director of the Master in International Energy at Sciences Po Paris School of International Affairs, and Mehmet Öğütçü, Chairman of the London Energy Club and former Turkish diplomat. So thank you all for being here this evening. And on that note, we'll get right into the topic. So my first question is for Mr. Öğütçü. So most media reports on the green transition understandably focus on the renewable energy component without necessarily giving a complete picture of all the various moving parts involved. Given your experience and expertise, what are the broad contours of global energy trends, as well as the major challenges facing the green transition, including issues such as financial burdens and international liabilities?
Well, Michael, thank you, first of all, to you and also TRT World for launching this digital debate on such a critical matter that is high on the agenda of every government, companies, civil society, international organizations. I think we all know that we face a dramatically different energy future than we have anticipated over the past decade. We have a new situation in many regards. I think it's important perhaps to highlight a couple of them, especially in light of what you described, post-COVID-19 environment. It's not post yet. COVID-19 or its variations, 2021, 22, Delta and other variants will be with us in the foreseeable future. Therefore, we have to factor in all our analysis and calculations on the basis that such calamities might still come up in the years ahead. So we have to be alert and prepared. I think this is one critical issue. They caught us unprepared in many ways. One of the key issues in my view is the name of the game changed now. The new name is the speed with which things are happening in the energy industry. Because for people like me, I work in the oil and gas industry for long years as chief executive, director, non-executive director, now strategic consultancy. We always thought that the time span will be about 20 years for your actions to bear fruit. Whereas what we see now with this speed of policy making, speed of technologies, speed of actions, things are becoming quite fast, at a faster pace. I think that's the number one issue. The speed is very important. Then technology, we have seen significant technological breakthroughs on electrification, on renewables, not only solar and wind, but also in hydrogen and nuclear. Fourth and fifth generation of nuclear is being taught, smart grids, and also smart devices, which bring consumers very close or directly to accessing energy. And also the other issue that we are facing is the abundance of supply in world energy. Before, we were so concerned about the lack of energy or scarcity of energy, which gave rise to geopolitical conflicts and competition. Right now, what we see is that there is abundance of oil, abundance of coal, abundance of natural gas, as well as renewables, excess capacity in many countries. Then, in contrast with that, we also see the global energy demand is slowing. It might be peaking, energy demand might be peaking from early 2030s. It will change also some character. And for the first time in history, the connection or interrelation between economic growth and global energy demand might be disrupted. So they will not be directly linked to one another. Especially in oil, we are expecting a slowdown in demand and perhaps peaking it, plateauing by 2035. And the same might happen with coal, which fell out of favor in many countries. And gas demand will continue, but for how long? This is something that we have to discuss. Then also we have the global roadmap now, drawn by all international organizations and governments, to reach net zero emission by 2050. For some regions like European Union, US, China, perhaps the target date might change, but that's the global roadmap. Of course, it cannot be affected without a main road, because there's so much gap, a wider gap between the ambitious rhetoric and actual policy actions by governments on net zero emissions. European Union is going by Green Deal, 1 trillion euro is reserved for that. United States is discussing, Samantha might be talking about this perhaps, about the new Green Deal, and the Chinese have this green growth project. So every country almost or region are focusing on that. Of course, the progress will be different in different places, regions, and countries, depending on their actual situations. Then digitalization is becoming the norm. Automation, as I said before, is making also individuals, the companies, access energy directly. And it will also provide us a greater focus for energy efficiency saving in many ways. We are not talking about renewables when we talk about the low carbon economy or green revolution. Also, the new infrastructure or re-engineering of the existing infrastructure to fit the renewables, smart grids, and all others, I think is a huge challenge. There is less appetite now among the investors to spend money on natural gas pipelines, for example. And the money where it flows, because this is the well-known cliche, follow the money. If you follow the money, $1.5 trillion of investment made in the energy industry last year. The bulk of it went to the renewables. And in the London Energy Club that I chair, we had a meeting a couple of months ago. All the multilateral financial institutions and private bankers present in that meeting made it clear that they are not going to spend a penny in the foreseeable future for fossil fuels. So the companies that have the financial muscles, they can do it. But getting funding from financial institutions will be increasingly difficult for fossil fuels. Of course, this is going to create also some sort of supply crunch in the foreseeable future. If you don't invest in oil, gas, coal, nuclear, hydro, then of course there is going to be significant crunch in supply in the future. The geopolitics also have changed. We all know that energy and geopolitics are inseparable. They go hand in hand. But with oil and natural gas declining in significance, renewables becoming not only the cheapest energy and cleanest energy, but also locally produced, I think this will reduce frictions in terms of energy transportations across oceans or across continents by pipelines. Therefore, we have to see a new debate on how geopolitics will be reshaped, not only around oil and gas, but renewables, lithium, cobalt, these new mines that are going to be very important power generation as well as other areas. So I don't want to prolong this, but one last point I want to make is that also energy markets are becoming more and more integrated globally. So regional markets, even in natural gas, thanks to LNG, FSRU, and also this power grids. And also, if you look at the commodities, still we have the volatility, but there are also new energy and environment-related commodities, products coming into the market. So we have a totally and dramatically different energy picture of today, and it's going to be even more different than as we anticipated over the next 10 years and 20 years. So with these words, I thought that we could perhaps kick off the discussion, and we are in your hands, Michael.
Thank you, Mr. Uchu. I'm going to come back to the geopolitical question a little bit later, but I want to just keep it on this general level for now, and I'm going to go to Samantha Gross. Of course, one of the Biden administration's first undertakings upon coming into office was to rejoin the Paris Agreement, of course, marking an important, if not symbolic, return for the U.S. to the global environmental conversation. How can the U.S. establish itself as a global climate leader, given its past record, particularly under the Trump administration? And what actions has this administration taken thus far on a concrete level to do so?
Thank you so much for the question, and thanks for the invitation to be here today. The United States is really in a bit of a hole with respect to its position on the global stage with respect to climate. The last 4 years of the Trump administration have been really harmful. And this isn't the first time this has happened. If you think about the swings that we have done from the George W. Bush administration to Obama, then to Trump, and now to Biden, this is a scene that the world has seen before, and it has painted the U.S. as not a particularly reliable partner on matters of climate. And that's a challenge for us, particularly for the Biden administration that ran on the idea that climate is extremely important, one of the great challenges of our age, and that we want to be a global leader on climate. I think the really important way for us to regain a mantle of leadership is to get the store in line at home. We need to focus on actions in the United States in order to have the credibility to then work abroad. What you've seen the Biden administration focus on, because of the divide in Congress and the political divide in the United States on issues of climate, the main thing that's happening in the United States right now is climate action taking place through things that the administration can do on its own, through regulatory actions under existing laws, and then also a lot of focus on climate in the infrastructure package that it's working its way through Congress right now. These are actions that are broadly popular or that the Biden administration can do it on its own with little or no support from the Republican side. And so you're seeing a lot of focus on that. A lot of focus on the carrot side of climate, on providing benefits for green investments, on providing greener infrastructure, things that the United States can actually do with a somewhat recalcitrant Republican group in Congress. The other thing that is really important for the U.S. to establish leadership on the global stage in climate again is a focus on financing. When you look at what the world needs, trillions of dollars of investment are needed to bring about this incredible change that we're looking for, and also at the speed that we're looking for, as was mentioned earlier, and I completely agree. And no government can contribute enough money to actually make this happen. But what I think we need to focus on going into the upcoming COP and going forward is leveraging government money. A lot of investments in developing countries and renewable energy in particular are profitable. And so there's a lot of place for government money to be used to de-risk investments and to make them more attractive to private investors. The underlying investments are often attractive and profitable, but just carry a bit too much risk. And so there's a real place for the United States to help encourage financing and to help bring in a lot more private financing into the green revolution. So those are two areas where I'm really looking to the United States to reestablish its leadership on the issue.
Thank you for that, Samantha Gross. So you talked a little bit about the importance of financing and sort of this economic component. I want to just, on a slightly related note, but switch gears a little bit and switch parts of the world. We'll go to you, Professor Luciani. How is this sort of green revolution or transition to renewables, how is it set to impact the political economy of Middle East oil-producing states in particular, particularly amongst the GCC in the years to come? Are there some governments that are more prepared than others for a world that is less dependent on fossil fuels? And what are those states that are more prepared doing that perhaps others in the region are not?
Thank you, Michael, for this question and for the invitation. Yes, of course, the GCC states are being directly impacted by the energy transition. But let me, before I get to the specific of the discussion, say something about the broader picture. And as you said at the beginning, there is a lot of talk about the green revolution, but unfortunately, there is not an equivalent amount of action. And I think I would like, relative to my distinguished colleagues that preceded me, to pour a little bit of cold water. As it is widely recognized and said by the latest IPCC report, and also by the International Energy Agency, what is being done at the moment is absolutely way short of what is needed. So we have the beginnings of an evolution, a transition, but the speed of it and the extent of it is absolutely not in line with what would be needed. So this is important because it's important for the GCC countries, because even in the net zero scenario that the International Energy Agency published a couple of months ago, which is a blueprint for something that should happen, but it's not what is happening, absolutely not what is happening, okay? Even in that scenario, there is expected to be continuing use of oil and gas, albeit at a reduced level, until 2050 and beyond. So that is important from the point of view of the Gulf oil producing countries. Also, that is one possible pathway towards net zero by 2050. It is not the only possible pathway. There are multiple variations that are possible. And specifically, one of the variations is the extent to which we will rely on carbon capture and sequestration. That is one of the huge question marks. Now, carbon capture and sequestration is one of the things that are not happening at the moment, but it is one of the things that most people, including, again, the International Energy Agency, and not only, deem absolutely necessary for the future, including the IPCC climate report, specifically assumes that there will be very extensive recourse to carbon capture and sequestration in order to absorb CO2 from the atmosphere. The Gulf producing countries are well positioned to pursue carbon capture and sequestration in a massive way. They have the physical conditions, the geological formations that allow to sequester CO2, and they have the financial means for the massive investment which is needed for that. And Saudi Arabia has been in the forefront proposing a policy in the context of the G20, proposing a policy of carbon circular economy. And that is something which has been well received by the other countries under certain conditions, specifically that it might be possible to certify the extent to which carbon emissions are effectively captured and sequestered. So the future for the oil-producing countries of the GCC is one in which oil and gas may well continue to be used internationally and certainly domestically in the context of diversification of their economies, therefore seeking a specialization in industrial processes that are energy intensive, combining that with carbon capture and sequestration, as well as the development of renewable sources that for which the Gulf countries are very well positioned, in the development of nuclear energy, which is another fundamentally important source of clean energy. And we see some of these developments already in the Gulf countries. Not to the extent, again, not to the extent that would be necessary. So there, again, the talk is far more advanced than the action, and credibility will have to be established by putting action in the ground, okay? There are profound differences in between the individual countries. The lead is certainly with the United Arab Emirates and specifically Abu Dhabi, that have been making substantial progress in both renewable energy and nuclear energy, and are pushing, doing significant process also for carbon capture and sequestration. Saudi Arabia has been doing a lot of talking, less action for the time being. The rest of the crowd is much more timid and is not, there are some interesting solar projects in Oman, but basically not much worth speaking of in Bahrain or Kuwait. And Qatar, of course, is in a peculiar position as a major producer of LNG. I should stress that the demand for oil, gas, and coal is rising. In the past few months, the prices of all three have been extremely high. So, on the evidence of what is happening today, talk about the peak demand in oil, gas, and perhaps even coal is not supported by empirical data, and that is something which needs to be taken in consideration.
Thank you, Professor. So I want to get back to you, Mehmet Utcu, in just a second here, but I just want to go back to Samantha Gross quickly, sort of on this point of this gap between talk and action that Professor Luciani was referring to. I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to what, in sort of the absence of, let's say, very firm government or even international action, in the U.S. context in particular, what are U.S. energy producers and industry in general doing on their own, if anything, to advance emission reduction, this type of thing? And then sort of as a related question, which will lead into the next topic of the discussion, what lessons has both industry and government learned in terms of adaptations resulting from at least the early period of the COVID-19 related restrictions, where sort of everything sort of shut down, as well as the subsequent economic contraction that we've experienced?
Right. I'll start by saying that I completely agree with our other two speakers in that there's really a disconnect between global ambition and, frankly, what the IPCC says we need to do, between the ambition of some young young activists on climate, what they say we should do, and the actions that we're seeing on the ground. That is absolutely true everywhere. And remind me of the first part of the question again, just very briefly. I'm sorry.
No worries at all. I'm just wondering in terms of this lack of concrete action from states and international bodies, what industry is doing, if anything, in this regard.
Thanks so much. I got too much question all at once. The thing that we're seeing is that, particularly in the United States, where the government has been less on board, particularly during the 4 years of the Trump administration, but companies see which way the wind is blowing. And many of these, particularly very large companies, don't just work in the United States. They work in Europe, they work in other countries where public concern about climate is a bit higher. And they also have a public image to protect, frankly. Very large companies that are household names don't want to be seen as a negative influence on the climate, an issue that regular people are caring about more and more over time. And so you're seeing companies, even in the absence of government action, start to push to deal with their own emissions, make their own net zero or carbon reduction goals. You're also seeing in the United States, subnational governments, states and cities put together emissions reductions plans for their own areas. In the United States, we have a federal system where some things are strictly under the purview of the federal government, but other things like some parts of transportation, many parts of the electric grid are actually governed at the state level or at the local level. And so you're seeing state and local governments also take actions to reduce their own emissions. So even during the 4 years of the Trump administration, when frankly the US government was going backwards, the US federal government was going backwards in terms of climate policy, you still saw emissions reductions in the United States, and you still saw companies and subnational governments moving forward, which is helpful. And it meant that there wasn't a perfectly US-shaped hole in global climate action. And for that, I'm grateful. So particularly in companies that have a public face, you continue to see them taking action because they don't want the blowback of being part of the problem, and instead they want to be part of the solution. In terms of the COVID-19 pandemic, one of the most important changes that we saw during the pandemic was just a complete shutdown in the transportation system. And that played itself out in terms of reductions in oil demand and a real cratering of global oil prices. And this is true everywhere. We saw oil prices that we hadn't seen in years. Those are starting to recover now, as Professor Luciani pointed out in his remarks. But the question is, particularly as the COVID crisis just continues to go on with variants and with delays and with reluctance among folks to get vaccinated, whether we'll continue to see this reduction in transportation demand. We're seeing that play out in terms of global oil demand and global oil prices. They've been really volatile recently based on news on what's happening with the Delta variant and whether markets believe that people will come back to traveling. Everything from air travel to day-to-day commuting to, in the United States, driving for summer vacations and family visits. So the real question for me going forward over the longer term, as we at some point pull out of the pandemic, is how many of these travel changes become permanent? How frequently will events like this happen online instead of happening in person, with the three of us flying somewhere to be on the stage to speak to a live audience, or at least a partially live audience? How often will I do meetings like the one I did earlier today online with people in the US versus flying somewhere to meet them? How much have people gotten used to working virtually from home versus going into offices? All of those things will impact the future of transportation, and most particularly the future of oil demand. And so it remains to be seen how much of this is pent-up demand that's going to come back when we get ourselves out of the pandemic, and how much of these are fundamental changes in the way we live our lives, in the way we do business, that may stick around after the pandemic. And so those are the questions that I'm asking myself, but I think the answers still remain to be seen. And it depends on how much we want to get back to our old way of life versus how much we find that we like the way of the life that we've created under the constraints of the pandemic.
Yeah, I think that point of volatility and a lot of unknowns is something that's very important right now. Mehmet Ucu, on that point, if we're looking at the sort of longer term outlooks as much as we can sort of see them right now in terms of this post-pandemic era, how do you think the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted both the approach to and perspective on this green transition or transition to renewables, particularly in states that have an outsized dependence on traditional energy sources for economic growth? Have you heard any discussions around how this impacts strategic energy outlooks looking towards the future, or is the uncertainty that's sort of building around all of this still kind of dominating the discussion? Mr. Ucu, your microphone is muted.
Me unmuted, yes.
Excellent, thank you.
Thank you for the questions. As Samantha mentioned, I think very fortunate for all of us, the new US administration has decided to take a leadership role again, as opposed to what Trump was trying to do in an isolationist manner. And so this is also one point that we were missing. There are new players on world energy. Of course, US has always been one of the most powerful players, but now in oil production and gas production and LNG trading, US has become a global leader, as opposed to US becoming extremely dependent on external sources, especially from the Middle East, Venezuela, Canada. So that's a very important decision to make. And then also on the global climate change area, together with China and the European Union, they are joining forces. This is a very unusual alliance, actually, because when I was working for IEA back in early 1990s, we worked so hard to bring China to the climate change discussion and debate. They always shied away, saying that we are a less developed country and we don't want to take any responsibilities, commitments. But right now, what you see is that the Chinese have turned it into a sort of a technology instrument, sort of green growth and export, and also competing with the US and European Union countries on who is going to become the global. But we know, judging from the existing data, that China is the major renewable or green energy power in the world to reckon with. They are spending more on R&D and innovation than US and European Union combined. Artificial intelligence and all other matters will be enhancing the Chinese sense. So I think we have to also bring China into discussion in this regard as one of the largest consumers, but also some of the suppliers in certain areas. COVID-19 has changed all our calculations, as I mentioned. No longer business as usual. We have to adapt ourselves to that. Demand has declined, although there are some pickups and growth in demand when there are news that the vaccinations are continuing and the cases are dropping. But then a couple of months later, again, we see a different situation because of the new variants coming to the picture and also bringing demand at a slower course. Therefore, also I think the situation has changed in OPEC. Now OPEC on itself cannot influence the world markets. Now we have OPEC plus Russia leading some other non-OPEC nations. US sometimes is intervening in a very clear manner, especially during the Trump era, on OPEC decisions. So what the production will be, supply to the markets, and how Russians, Saudis, and also most recently the United Arab Emirates will be shaping the oil markets, which all indications show will be slowing and plateauing, with the peak coming up in 2035, according to IEA projections. And also electrical vehicles. Now we have more than 10 million electrical vehicles in the market, and it is going to increase by leaps. Not even hydrogen-powered cars we are seeing in China. Just last week, they announced that another 10,000 vehicles powered by hydrogen will be on the market. So these are dramatic changes which will make our projections redundant, and also outdated. All our projections, which we made when I was working for the IEA back in early 1990s, now are ridiculous, because we thought that there will be 5% renewable in the world energy mix, and what we see in certain countries, almost in power generation, more than 50%. And this is going to change, as we all mentioned. I think both Samantha and Giacomo also said, the name of the new game is speed. We cannot follow it. Therefore, I think rather than long-term projections to 2050, who is going to be there, we don't know. It's good to have long-term projections, but I think most of them will be outdated even long before we reach these states. It's good to have this net zero emissions by 2050, but it will be all rhetoric. I think we have to focus on short and medium-term measures and actions that we can see. Of course, the governments need a roadmap, and it will be a different roadmap for each country, each region, as I mentioned. But I think the reality on the ground will be much different 5 years later, rather than thinking about 2050. And I'm also concerned, in addition to what Giacomo said, about what might emerge in the Middle East and Eurasia, because these are the countries heavily dependent on the export revenues. Once you peak the oil demand, once renewables, electrical vehicles, nuclear, hydrogen will become more prominent, and oil and gas will be less and less valuable for these nations, although they have huge reserves still, but they are sustaining their political system and social fabric, solidarity, through handouts gained from the hydrocarbon exports. If this disappears or reduced significantly, expect more social disturbances and political crisis in these regions, which will have serious implications for all of us. I think that's another point we have to bear in mind related to geopolitics and energy.
Thank you for that, Mehmet Uçu. I want to get sort of sticking with this post-pandemic idea, but also moving a little bit into this realm of sort of the politics and geopolitics of renewables and this green transition. Professor Luciani, we spoke a little bit about moves that states that are really dependent on fossil fuel exportation are going to make in the years to come. And Mr. Uçu spoke of the sort of difficulty in long-term projections that we're seeing right now, in particular because of the speed at which things are moving. I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to this, the idea of diversification in the strategic outlooks of large energy producers, again, particularly in the MENA region. How has the COVID-19 pandemic, if at all, and its resulting economic impact, influenced the long-term planning in energy-producing states, if at all? Or are they looking more, again, to this sort of short and medium term for how they're going to deal with this kind of emerging world?
Well, it should be said that the oil-producing countries, especially the ones in the Gulf, but in general, have for a very long time been aware of the need to diversify their economies. Policies for diversification have existed in some cases ever since the independence of the country. Let's be reminded that the United Arab Emirates, for example, only became independent in 1971, which is not that long ago. Saudi Arabia has always been independent, and they have had a planning for development exercise ever since 1970. So the need for diversification has been understood, at least in theory, for a long time. Action has not always been coherently put in place. I think, although it is undoubted and not disputable that the economy of these countries has been profoundly transformed over the decades. Okay, a lot of industrial activities have developed. Important service activities have developed, and of course there are new ideas about the future. My own point of view is that some of the projects that are being pursued do not have much of a prospect down the road. I am rather critical of some, while others are much more promising. And especially, I believe that diversification based on the natural resource endowment of these countries, which is oil, but not exclusively oil. Certainly diversification into petrochemicals and other heavy energy-intensive industry, based on the potential for further production of hydrocarbons, but also other minerals, and the potential for exploiting solar and wind energy, and as well, I repeat, nuclear energy, because I believe it's an important part of the picture. All of these are present and are being pursued. Okay, so I think you have to keep in mind that this is a game in which many participants take decisions and take initiatives. And in the end, it will not be shaped by a single mind establishing a global plan, but it will be shaped, the evolution will be shaped by the interaction of decisions made by different players that have different interests. It's obvious that the oil-producing countries have an interest in defending the economic value of oil and gas. There are things that they can do to defend and maintain a role for oil and gas, even in a decarbonizing world. They may do, or they may fail to do these things. Okay, so it depends on their ability to pursue their own interests with actual action. Certainly, coming to what Mehmet was mentioning, certainly in order to maintain the economic value of oil and gas, these countries have a need to engage in massive investment. So the burden of investment, this is true in general for all of our countries. The energy transition requires a very significant shift from consumption to investment in the allocation of resources. And this is very problematic. It is true for the oil-producing countries. They need to invest much more, and so they will need to redefine some of their priorities. I always repeat that the number one priority is the extent of resources that they devote to weapons, military equipment, security, which looks very excessive. So when I look at the region, my first question is, will this region be able to live in peace? Will the players in the region be able to reach the compromises that are needed to close some of the long-standing conflicts that are going on? And unfortunately, we speak in these days with the collapse of the Afghan government, the advent of Taliban power in Afghanistan. So when I look at the region, what I see is a region ridden with conflicts and incapable of pursuing its own interests. And I don't think countries can do that in isolation. Even if you are Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates, you will not be able to pursue a policy of decarbonization and the political evolution that is needed to face the necessary shift from consumption to investment unless the regional environment evolves in a positive direction. So the path ahead is extremely problematic, but there is a potential for a path ahead, and one should recognize it.
That's a very, I think, important point you raised in terms of the regional situation and how it might or how likely impact states in that region in particular moving forward. We'll come back to that point. I want to bring in sort of a related point, looking at strategic outlooks and energy security, particularly in the United States. Samantha Gross, what role do discussions around strategic energy security in the U.S. What role do they play in sort of framing the approach to green transition, renewable energies in the United States in particular? And how does such a obviously sensitive, strategically important issue impact the U.S. approach to climate change internationally, as well as its sort of relationship, or now less dependent relationship, with oil-producing states?
I'd like to take the answer to this question in a couple of different directions. And first, to build on what Professor Luciani just talked about. When you think about U.S. diplomatic action, U.S. military focus, a lot of that has been on protecting energy supply. And even though the United States is now the world's largest oil producer and a significant producer of natural gas, still those international markets matter to us, and they're still an important focus of our international diplomacy. It's often said that the last barrel of oil that will be produced in Saudi Arabia, for the reason that they have both vast resources and quite inexpensive resources. But the real question for me is, at what price will that barrel of oil be sold? As demand declines and as we work our way down the cost curve, and we have only those low-cost producers surviving, the question then becomes not, can that oil company make money at that price? They almost certainly can. But what does that price do to the political economy and the political fabric of those countries? And that's somewhat what Professor Luciani was talking about. How do you transition a rentier economy, one that's focused on distributing revenues from hydrocarbons, into a more diversified economy? And that, I think, is going to be a real question for security in the region, for the focus of U.S. security and diplomacy thinking. It will likely change our relationship with the region, and it will likely change relationships within the region in a way that, for oil-producing reasons, particularly in the Middle East, may become very complicated. And so that will have implications for U.S. security strategy and foreign policy. I'd also like to think, I'm often asked about the role of critical minerals going forward, and are minerals like lithium, for instance, or rare earth minerals going to become the new oil, and are they going to play the role that oil plays in U.S. national security thought going forward? And to some extent it might, but those minerals are actually pretty widely distributed, although they're not particularly widely mined and refined now. And so I think we'll see a real focus, both from a business perspective, but also from a national security perspective, of working to develop more sources for those minerals, of pushing along a more global and more diversified market in those minerals. And we have to remember that they play a different role in the energy system than oil does. Oil is a fuel. If we don't have oil supply, if it's embargoed or slowed or gets expensive for some reason, stuff that uses that just comes to a halt. Whereas these are raw materials. The existing infrastructure still works if we have a slowdown or a lack of availability in raw materials. It's just that we can't build new. And so the different role that they play in an economy changes the role that they'll play geopolitically as well. But I think we'll have a real rethink in both U.S. diplomacy policy and U.S. security and military policy. Stepping back for a minute into how energy security will play into the energy transition in the United States. The U.S. is really blessed with a lot of resources in a lot of different ways. We clearly have significant oil and gas resources that we're exploiting today, but we also have significant renewable resources as well: wind, solar, geothermal, offshore wind. And so the US is really well positioned to take advantage of those resources. And so this does not have to be a step back in terms of energy security for the United States. In the US political debate, there's a lot of focus on jobs and the number of jobs and the amount that the hydrocarbons industry currently contributes to the US economy. And it's often presented of, oh, we can't get rid of this number, this contribution to GDP, this contribution to employment. But the thing is, the transition to a renewable economy, it brings on jobs as well, brings on new jobs. And so what we have to think about in the US domestic political debate is how to do that transition, how to help communities that are in the hydrocarbon business now redevelop and find new things to do. They may not necessarily be the same places where we develop wind or solar, other sorts of resources. These are going to be frequently one-off solutions that are very location specific. But for both our own energy security and for the political debate, we'll need to focus on how to help hydrocarbon-dependent communities change into a new political economy. We've certainly seen, say, cities in the Rust Belt. Pittsburgh is a good example that used to thrive based on its steel industry and is now moved along to becoming a high-tech hub. It has excellent universities. So this can be done, but we'll have to think about how to do it a bit more quickly and how to do it with more support in order for the US political climate to support a transition towards greener energy.
Thanks for that. Mehmet Ochu, staying on this topic of both energy security and sort of geopolitical implications of, green transition to renewables, changing dynamics in oil producing regions. And in your view, what are the major geopolitical implications of a transition away from fossil fuels in the Middle East in particular, but in general for oil producing states as well as the world's major energy consumers? And on a related question, and sort of bringing in China just a little bit into the discussion here, what type of impact might China's BRA have on the development of renewables? How are renewables planned into China's BRA? And what sort of economic opportunities and challenges does this present to partner countries, again, particularly in Eurasia and the Middle East? We seem to have lost Mehmet there. Okay, well, we'll come back to that. So we'll go to Professor Luciani then. On this question of the geopolitical impacts on oil-producing countries in particular. And you've spoken a little bit to this in terms of the long-term strategic outlooks and the challenges that the regional dynamics will pose to many of these states moving forward. I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit more to, how geopolitical realignments, I should say, in the region and the world more generally, might impact Middle Eastern oil-producing states in terms of these efforts to diversify their economic growth, to diversify their energy output, etc. And this really important question of, can their current sort of rentier state model survive this transition? Or will a post-oil economy or our transition towards a post-oil economy require deeper political and economic reforms in these states?
Let me begin by the second one, the future of the rentier state. I think that's if you have a rosy scenario, okay, a positive, an optimistic scenario, this is one in which the region finds a path towards compromise, peace, regional integration, increased regional trade, and development of domestic industry and agriculture within the region. At the same time, you have the necessary massive shift from consumption to investment, which is very difficult. I mean, the vast majority of the people in the region are poor, very poor, and they face an immediate challenge to their survival in Yemen, in Lebanon, for that matter, even these days, in Syria, in Iraq. I mean, you name it. In Egypt, okay, in the Sudan, you name it. These are all very poor countries with a large number of very poor people. And the situation of these people must be addressed. So there is a huge need for investment. There is a huge need for redistribution of income there as well as in the rest of the world. And the energy transition makes it even more urgent and necessary. So that is an optimistic scenario. In this optimistic scenario, the state must evolve. We cannot continue to be a rentier state. It will need to evolve and find new sources of legitimation. That is, in my opinion, some form of democratic transition, which has been cut short after the Arab Spring, okay, and is obviously challenged until now. Now, this is a very optimistic scenario. A more, perhaps a realistic scenario is one in which the region will not succeed anytime soon to overcome its divisions and conflicts. In this kind of, I often speak of the existence of a regional civil war. More frequently, we hear about the civil war in Libya, in Yemen, in Iraq, in Syria. But in fact, these are one phenomenon, because the political forces that are fighting each other are the same in all these countries, and there is very close contamination and interrelationship between the situation in one country and that in the rest of the region. So if the regional civil war cannot find a conclusion with some compromise, then the future is one in which the governments will continue to rely on income from fossil fuels and use that income increasingly for repression, which is unfortunately what we see in abundance in the region. So, the future is in the hands of the people of the region and their rulers. The level of bad governance that we see in the region. Just think of Lebanon and the past year in Lebanon. I mean, it's unbelievable. And at this level of bad governance, nothing good can happen. So whether some country like Abu Dhabi, more so than the entire United Arab Emirates or Qatar, these are countries that have accumulated such large financial resources internationally that they can, in theory, live off their financial revenue, their profits, and payments from the rest of the world, even if they stop producing oil and gas. Especially if you think in terms of the relationship between nationals and expatriates. 95% of the population of the United Arab Emirates is expatriates. So if all that you need to do is to keep the nationals happy, the amount of money that has been accumulated internationally is sufficient to maintain a kind of rentier state for a very long time, okay? But this is not what the people have in mind, and it's not what they are aiming at, and it's not an easily achieved objective in the context of a region that continues to be ridden with conflicts.
Thank you for that, Professor. There's so much to talk about in this topic. Of course, we're getting a bit on with time, so I'll have one last question. We'll give the final word to Mehmet Öğütçü before we close the session. And I kind of want to, I guess this is probably a topic in and of itself on its own, but I think it's important to shed light on it in this context. I'm wondering what kind of impacts might China's BRI have on the development of renewables? How is renewable energy in particular factored or not factored into the Belt and Road Initiative? And what sort of economic opportunities as well as challenges does this present to partner countries, particularly in Eurasia and the Middle East region that Professor Luciani was speaking about?
Thank you, Michael. Well, as I mentioned, I think China is a global energy superpower in many ways, not only because of its huge energy demand, consumption, and technological development based on artificial intelligence and also new breakthroughs, but also through its outreach globally. China is no longer an isolationist power. And when you look around from Africa to Latin America, European Union countries, even to US, and Southeast Asia, Australia, China is a huge commercial power in energy, but also a political power and financing power. BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, launched a long time ago by the President Xi Jinping, and is the only game in town, actually, in terms of a visionary project initiative. It has so many, of course, drawbacks, so many illusionary aspects, but still it's the biggest game in town in terms of infrastructure, from pipelines to grids, roads, ports, and whatever you can think of. And renewable energy is also included. It includes almost 85 countries in the world. I don't think it's working properly because Chinese don't have the experience of such cross-border initiatives like US or European Union countries had in the past. But it is a factor that should be taken into account by all of us. Trillions of dollars are there. However, let's not forget that Chinese, of course, with regard to Chinese, not everything is rosy picture. Their economy is faltering because of the COVID, declining export revenues, and social disturbances, and gap between haves and have-nots. So there are serious difficulties there. But BRI will have a significant impact in making Chinese not only an energy producer, consumer, but a global energy power to reckon with around the world through exports of also renewables, efficiency devices and technologies, and also in terms of access to this rare earth and minerals like cobalt, lithium, in Africa, in Latin America, it is going to be the biggest competitor to the US and European Union. So if we are talking about the new geopolitics of energy, I think Chinese, so far isolated and also limited itself in its own region, Central Asia, Russia, Southeast Europe, now Southeast Asia, now it is becoming a global power to reckon with in terms of geopolitics. Not only security of shipping lanes, in which Chinese, I think, will no longer be a free rider, because the US was providing the security umbrella for long years in the Gulf, in Pacific, in Atlantic. Now, Chinese will take responsibility in that regard. I think one point that has to be made is no matter how powerful Chinese are, or other countries, US or European Union, in renewables, we should be very careful in making the point that renewables are not an immediate solution always. So we should be mindful of the fact that if we put so much emphasis on renewables, yes, it's the cheapest and cleanest form of energy for power generation especially, but if it undermines the existing supply systems without replacing it fully, it is going to be dangerous. It might endanger, I think, the system in countries where fossil fuels are still dominant. You cannot have this transition so quickly. Look at China. Almost 75 to 80% of energy in Chinese mix of energy is still coal. By 2050, it's going to be still 60% in the most optimistic scenarios. Look at India. so much coal-based country, Russia. So we are not going to change it overnight. Yes, we know that the name of the game is the speed, but it will take a long time. So in the meantime, our foreseeable future is still with some of the fossil fuels, especially oil and gas, and less in coal, of course, we know that. And so that's the important point to make. And I want to, before concluding, say a few words about my own country as well, Turkey, if you don't mind. In terms of energy security, I think it's one of the clearest examples in the world of how a nation can move forward in ensuring its energy supply security. Because Turkey heavily depends right now, especially in fossil fuels, on imports. 98% in natural gas imported. 93% of our oil imported. And of course, there are very significant steps to be taken in terms of increasing the share of renewables in the energy mix. I think we are quite successful in that, in energy efficiency as well. However, still, in fossil fuels where we don't produce, we depend heavily outside, and it's a serious national security matter for us. It's not only energy security, but national security for a nation, which is the 17th largest in the world in terms of economic size, and 6 or 7 in the European Union. Therefore, I think we have to make sure that every nation has different needs, circumstances, and Turkey, unfortunately, has not ratified yet 2015 Paris Climate Change Agreement. We signed it, but we have not ratified it yet because of some circumstances that we can discuss later if you like. So it's a microcosm of what's happening in many other parts of the world as well. So sustainable, critical energy security, with or without fossil fuels, with increasing share of renewables, will be still with us. So I think collaboration, partnership are the key words that have been so for so many years, but in the future as well, because I believe that we will not have the traditional wars of energy security as happened in the past, in Iraq, Kuwait, and elsewhere. I think we will have new types of competition. And I'm not very optimistic, as Giacomo also said, about the Middle East and Central Asia. These are the regions heavily dependent on hydrocarbon revenues. Unfortunately, because of the lack of diversification, because they talk about diversification when there is the word, catchword, reforms, and also commodity prices are coming down. So there is a need to, I think, speed up the reform efforts, good governance in these countries, to diversify the economy and make a more, I think, fair distribution of revenues to the society so that we can avoid catastrophic political and social consequences in the regions, which will affect all of us at the end of the day.
Thank you, Mehmet Uçu. Lots of points to discuss. It's difficult to get to all of them, but I really appreciate all of you joining me this evening and joining us here at TRT World Forum Digital Debates for the launch of this new series. We hope to have you all back again to discuss these and other topics in detail. Professor Giacomo Luciani, Samantha Gross, and Mehmet Uçu, thank you so much for, again, joining us on this really fascinating discussion this evening. Thank you for your time, and we hope to see you again in the near future.
Thank you.
Thank you.